revolution for last century. And this certainly has repercussions on mobility. When you look at the considerations between daughters and mothers, we should revise the pessimistic outlook on social mobility that characterized many societies, such as the US society. But if we look at the issue of social mobility in general, then the increase of women employment, as well as the increase in women's income, can also lead us to a different direction. In women families, basically, there is to be a more relationship among women. Rachel Fernandez is a professor at the New York University. She's one of the most distinguished researchers on this issue. Her contribution is important to understand the social dynamics of the politics of women and economics of women. What is most interesting is that this gender approach by Professor Fernandez took her to consider the different cultural variables in the general framework of the economic discourse, developing models that are common in many studies, different from the ones that she's going to share with us today. What she's going to share with us today, indeed, is very much focused on a very interesting hypothesis. She talked about equity as well. She's going to talk about wealth, trying to answer the question, was it economic growth to ease the way for women to acquire certain rights? And the title of this lecture is a bit provocative. I found it a bit irritating, even, because it meant to be provocative. As a matter of fact, Professor Fernandez is going to show us that in her case, this is a truth. Is this increase in rights, is it something that men yielded to us, or is it something that women vanquished for themselves? So what is the power at stage? It is the power of ownership. So the study that Professor Fernandez is going to share with us refers to a special society, the US society in the 18th century, but the issue of property right was not very different in Europe because, again, women would lose their right to property as soon as they got married. And this changed based on men's judgments, in that when men become fathers, they basically change attitude when it comes to women owning their wealth. So basically, there's a change from patriarchy over to a more fatherly attitude. So again, it is always a decision of men whether to grant to women the possibility to own wealth. So let us give her the floor. Professor Fernandez is going to give us this talk. She's going to introduce the subject and the studies that she's carried out that are trying to sum it up, though not probably very comprehensively. And as is the habit with the festival, we're going to have some Q&A time. Over to you, Professor Fernandez.
Let me just try to go back to the beginning. Sorry, it's not on the first page. There we go. First of all, okay. Thank you for that very nice introduction. It was a very nice summary of my work. And I have to tell you, I'm a very modern woman. I'm very conflicted at the moment. I have been told by Roberta, 50 minutes maximum. My usual solution, talk very quickly, okay? But I've been told by the translators that they will make my life miserable afterwards if I talk very quickly. So I have to somehow stay in between, okay? So I will try to do the best I can, but I might go a little bit either faster or slower than optimal, okay? In any case, I am extremely happy to be here. I would like to thank the organizers and Tito Boeri in particular. He was very kind to invite me to the second festival that was held here many years ago when I spoke about culture and the role of women. And I was glad to be able to fit this topic in, which is on women's rights, into the general topic of social mobility. So thank you again for the invitation. Okay, so let me start. Let me start by giving you a little bit of a general motivation. So we've seen huge expansion in women's rights. This is not something that started today. It's been happening for the last 200 or so years. It's a process that's ongoing. We know a lot of countries in which women don't have full rights, and I cannot think of any country where women feel that you're treated just as equal to men in every single sphere. So this is still something that is very relevant for today in every single country. But still, this process of women getting more and more rights is a question that we would like to ask, well, why did it occur? You know, why, and in particular, why do we tend to see this positive correlation between women getting more rights and the economy's growing, development, so to speak? And when I say development, I'm going to speak quite broadly, quite vaguely, quite generally. And by that, I simply mean a process of growth and of declining fertility. Okay? Okay. What I'm going to do is I'm going to study a fundamental right, certainly from a point of view of an economist, okay, which is what I am, which is property rights. Now, sociologists may not consider property rights so important, I don't know, but for an economist, these are fundamental. And these are rights that women did not enjoy in full for centuries, neither in Europe nor in the United States. So in particular, what I will study today is a historical project rather than something of modernity, but it will certainly have bearing, I think, on development in general, and also I hope just shed further lights on women's rights. So what are married women's property rights? This is the rights that I'm going to look at. Well, let's start with maybe with a definition of what property rights are. Property rights are the legal rights to acquire, to own, sell, transfer property, to keep one's wages, to make contracts, to bring lawsuits, to, if you seek divorce, be able to keep some of your marital assets and maybe some control over your children. Okay? Now, both under Roman civil law, which, as you know, governed most of continental Europe, and under English common law, which is relevant to England and the United States, once women married, they lost these rights, okay? They lost, if not ownership, then at least control over their physical property. And upon divorce, it was not true that children went to the mother, children went to the father. Okay? So these reforms happened at different points in time for different countries. Married women got these property rights, but the timing varied both in the United States, across states, and in Europe. I'm going to be basing my talk on the United States because I would like to show you empirical evidence. And the United States is a particularly good place to show empirical evidence because there's so many states, okay? And there's so many states that are giving or granting these rights at different points in time. And I can make use of the variation that exists in the United States to try to study this. So in the U.S., the majority of the states base their marital laws on English common law. And English common law is very romantic. It says when you get married, you become one person, okay? No longer two. You become one person, but which person is that? It's not a new person. It's your husband, okay? You become your husband, okay? A little bit of a gender change, but still, you become your husband, and it's under his wing, under his protection, what was called coverture, okay? Under his cover that you perform everything, okay? under the 19th century common law, a married woman was bound by these rules. And as I said before, under coverture, a husband controlled his wife's earnings if she worked, his wife's property, both real and personal. Married women were not allowed to enter into contracts without the permission of their husband, and there were very good reasons for this, legal reasons. You are your husband. So when you are entering into a contract, you are actually making your husband legally responsible. And that's not something we might want to do. You know, you might not want to have that. Okay. So why did married women obtain property rights? So the hypothesis that I am going to put forward has to do also with conflicting natures, but this is not psychology, this is going to be economics. So you can either be happy or sad about that. I'm going to tell you what the conflicts are, and then we're going to see how they get resolved. So the conflict is between two identities of man, man as a husband and man as a father. Now, as a husband, what we'll call a patriarchal system, let's just call it that for short, a patriarchal system is great. I mean, it kind of gives you not only your own property, but rights over your wife's property. I mean, you can't sell it. There's all sorts of interesting details, which I won't talk about given the time constraints, but it's not that you have full rights over it, but you have a lot of rights. And in particular, you keep the rents. Okay? So that's really good for them. But as fathers, they're really hurt by this system because insofar as their daughters are concerned, who is benefiting? Well, the sons-in-laws. Okay, so that's bad for their daughters, and they care about their daughters. Of course, you could say, look at it from the other point of view and say, aha, but they have sons as well. And from the point of view of their sons, they're benefiting because they don't care necessarily about the daughters-in-law, and the sons can, you know, control the property of the daughters-in-laws. I'm going to show you that this is not equivalent. I'm going to show you that, or try to argue for you at the very least, that after a while, fathers in particular, are going to get unhappy about this. So what I'm going to explain further in a few minutes is that development, think of increasing wealth, decreasing fertility, is going to exacerbate the tension between your happiness as a husband and your happiness as a father, till eventually you decide, no, I actually prefer to give up my rights to, let's speak very basically, exploit my wife. Why? Because that will stop my daughters from being exploited. So you're going to give up those rights, and the system is going to change. Okay? I guess I should say from the beginning that despite the provocative question of were these rights given or were they granted, I think for this case, it's going to be fairly obvious that these rights are granted rather than, were these rights won or were they granted? In this case, they're going to be granted rather than won. This is not a general lesson, but this is an important lesson of saying, when do the interests of men and women coincide? And in this case, they actually are going to, after a while, coincide. And what's good for women is actually going to be in the benefit of men as well. But I'm going to try to explain that. So what's the mechanism? And I'm going to go over it more than once, okay? I can't help it. I have a very strong pedagogical streak. So as fertility falls, or as the wealth increases, both of those things make men richer, okay? If you have few mouths to feed or if you have higher wealth, you're obviously richer. And one of the things that you try to do is try to increase the welfare of your children. How do you do this? You know, there's many ways, but one of the ways that you can think about doing this is increasing your bequests to children. And in case the translators don't know, bequests is what you leave your children, okay? Now, this primarily benefits the sons and not the daughters. And why is this? Well, because the husbands own and manage the wife's property, and therefore they kind of get the surplus from marriage. If you like, it's not that marriage doesn't necessarily make the wife better off, but what happens is that most of the gains from higher wealth or lower fertility end up going to the husband rather than to the wife. Okay? As development increases, what I'm going to argue is that this disparity between the welfare of your boys on the one hand and your girls on the other hand is going to increase. So there's going to be a bigger difference in the welfare. And this is going to make the fathers unhappy, and then they're going to get rid of the system and introduce a regime with more egalitarian rights. The model is going to predict is that if you have lower fertility or if you have higher wealth, you're going to do these reforms sooner. And we're going to look for that in the data. And I'm going to show you to what extent that is true. It's also going to predict that systems that treat married women better, and in particular, those with a community property system that came from the Napoleonic Code, those systems, the wife is initially better. She's going to be happier under those systems. But those systems are going to see reforms happen much later. So it's a little bit paradoxical, but systems that treat wives better will move to a system where women have more rights at a later point in time, everything else equal. Okay, that is for the same fertility, for the same wealth, it will happen later. Okay. Now, let me just very quickly try to situate this in the literature for you. So some rights obviously are won. Okay, they're not granted. And they're won either because there's a threat of revolt or a revolution, or because leaders are deposed and a new system comes into play. That's one literature. Another literature has looked at a variety of issues in economics and in history and says rights are conceded because it makes those in power better off. And what rights might those be? Well, there's arguments that actually the abolition of slavery happened. This is contentious, but the abolition of slavery happened because slaves were inefficient after a while. It became more efficient to let them be free wage earners rather than try to feed them, clothe them, monitor them yourselves. Okay? There's arguments about why suffrage was extended. That is why people got voting rights. So if you ever looked at historical episodes, you will see that voting rights are extended gradually in history. First, it's only a small elite of men who can have them. Then there's literacy and wealth requirements. Then there's, property requirements. And gradually these are, expanded and expanded till everyone gets them, including women. Okay? They're usually the last to get them. Okay? So there's that type of argument. There's universal education. Why don't we have a system of universal education now? Again, there's arguments that say, actually, it benefits capitalists or entrepreneurs, in a more neutral word maybe, to have a workforce that is educated. It's not very useful for you to educate your own workers because they go work somewhere else and you've paid for all their education. But if the state comes in and educates all the workers at the same time, well, then you have an educated workforce. So again, education, which sounds like a right that you might have fought for as a member of the working class, say, it might be a right that's actually given to workers because it makes capitalists better off. It helps to solve a problem. There's also the argument about, a similar argument made about child labor laws. For women's economic rights, which is what we're looking at today, two arguments have been made. One very similar to slavery, that it's inefficient, okay? And that simply says that this inefficiency, it's inefficient to have a woman doing things and not keeping the rents from her activities. And this inefficiency increases with capital or with wealth. And that as wealth increases, you have more of an incentive to get rid of this patriarchal system. I'm going to show that this doesn't really hold up very well in the data. It also doesn't hold up very well historically because women did not work outside the house, okay? Not if they were married, not if they were white, not in the United States at least. They did not work. There was probably less than 2% of women, married women, worked outside the house. So it couldn't be because of these rents, and then you might worry about housework, et cetera, but that's not a big deal. Dupke and Turtles have an argument that say, actually, the reason that women got these rights is because, education became more important. And men, short-sightedly, in a way that can be made rigorous, did not invest enough in boys or girls. They did not put enough funding in for these education. So by giving more rights to women, if women care more about children, women might help to cure this underinvestment problem because they will invest more in the education. Why? Because let's just assume that by nature they care more about the children than the father does. I'm going to show you that this also doesn't work. If I have time, I may not. And that it would be much easier to simply introduce mandatory education, which is actually what the U.S. did during this time period, than to give up your rights. Why give up your property rights as a man? Why not just introduce mandatory education? So the mechanism that I'm talking about today really relies on paternalism, in the Latin sense of the word, okay? That is on fathers caring, okay, about their children. And for that issue, it might be nice to ask, do we have any other evidence that speaks to fathers caring about their daughters in such a way that it influences their political behavior? Ebonia Washington has a very nice paper where she looks at U.S. Congress, and she looks at the way that these congressmen voted on issues that have to do with women's welfare. Okay, so there's many. You could think of abortion, you could think about Social Security that is more important for women than for men. You can think of a variety of issues that women are going to matter for. And what they do is that they show that a U.S. congressman is more likely to vote positively on these laws the greater is the proportion of his children that are girls. Okay? So if you have 4 kids and 3 of them are girls, you're more likely to vote in favor of these rights than if you have 4 kids and only one of them is a girl. Okay? So that's interesting evidence. And that's actually very interesting because it's actually real political behavior. In terms of political attitudes, it's a very nice paper also by Oswald and Padavi, who use British survey data and they find again that for a constant family size, so you have 3 kids, the more of those kids that are girls, the more likely you are to have left-wing preferences, whereby left-wing will understand the Labour Party. Okay? Okay, so let me go back to the basic theory. I'm going to drag you through the theory for a little while. There's not going to be any equations, I promise, and I'll just give you a few diagrams, and hopefully it will become clear what I'm trying to say. Okay, so we had basically said, okay, parents care about the welfare of their kids. As they get wealthier, they try to make the children better off by giving them bequests. But you might want to think about a patriarchal system almost as a method of taxation. It makes it very hard to make your daughter better off. You have to give them much more wealth to make them equally well off to a boy. Because, again, why? Because our husband's controlling the property. So it's very hard to make your daughter better off. That is relative to your son. It's not that hard to make your son better off. Okay? So as the economy grows, and I'm going to ask you to take this for granted, I'm not going to show you the math behind this, the welfare of both boys and girls is going to increase. And I'm going to say boys and girls, men and women, and wives and husbands kind of interchangeably, okay? And they're all playing that role. But the welfare gap between the genders increases. So what I've drawn here, okay, stand up for this, or maybe I know, stand up for this. This works, here is the amount of wealth that is in the household, okay? And as you can see, as wealth increases, the husband, which is H here, his happiness is going up with wealth. The happiness of a wife or of a girl is also going up, so they're both going up. But what I want you to see is that as wealth increases, the gap, the difference between the green line and the red line, which is a happiness gap, is increasing. So although both are being made better off because they're richer, boys are being made even better off than girls. So that gap between the two is increasing over time. So we are not arguing that growth is not good for women, growth is only good for men. That's not the argument. The argument is that it's differential. Okay? It increases the happiness of both, but it increases the happiness of men more than it increases the happiness of girls. Okay? So I want you to keep those pictures in your mind. Don't worry, I keep on showing you. I'm only going to ask you to remember that H is a husband, W is the wife or the woman, and P stands for patriarchy, okay, for the patriarchal system. Now, this growing welfare gap across their children, the gender of the children, is going to dampen the welfare increase of fathers. Everything else equal, they would prefer this gap not to increase. And you might say, well, that's only true if they care equally about their boys and their girls. What about if they care really a lot more about their boys than they care about the girls? We seem to sometimes think that, right? Well, that would still be true. It would mean that they wouldn't necessarily want the boys and the girls to be equally happy, but still there's going to come a time when the welfare differential between the boys and the girls is sufficiently large that the men are unhappy with this as well. They would love to change the system. That will make their sons unhappy at that moment, maybe, but they would want to change the system. Okay? So now I would like to do is to contrast this with a regime that allowed women to control their marital property. And I just want to show you how that regime behaves for 2 seconds. So this is the man's welfare under patriarchy. This is the green line that we saw before. On the x-axis, we have wealth. On the y-axis, we have welfare. It's increasing. So this we've seen before. Here is a man's happiness under what I've called equal rights. It's not really equal rights. It just means that women control their property rights, the property when they get married. So here is the happiness of a man, still a man, under equal rights. When will a man want to switch to this red system rather than stay in the green system, the patriarchal system? So let me put both curves together. And, you know, if you're an economist, then you're going to take this point very seriously. This is a point where the happiness under both regimes is equal. But for any level of wealth that's to the right of K star, the men are actually better off under equal rights than they are under patriarchy. You can see the same is not true here. Here, men prefer patriarchy to equal rights. And then it flips over, okay? So wealth makes it flip over, and as I become, what makes it flip here is the fact that men have become wealthier, and that has made them more impatient vis-a-vis the systems. Let me just try to give you 2 seconds of intuition for this result. So again, for this result, what is key is that growth is making... If you lived in one regime, equal rights, or if you lived in patriarchy, you would be happier as your wealth increased, no matter which regime you were under. But in fact, when you're very poor, the difference between being under patriarchy and being under equal rights is small. It's kind of strange. It says that actually where we really care about being a patriarchal regime, if you're a man, this is not where you care about it, because there's not that much of a difference in welfare. It's here that there's a large difference in the welfare between being under patriarchy vis-a-vis being under equal rights. And why is that the case? Well, because if you're poor, it doesn't really help so much to control your wife's property. She brings in an extra cow. Okay, great. Okay, but it's not such a big deal. It's as you get richer that the right to control your wife's property is a big deal to you. So here, the happiness gap between these two, between being under patriarchy and being under equal rights, is increasing. After a while, this inequality between your boys and girls starts to bother you more and more and more and more till you switch. And that's when we as economists would predict the switch would happen sometime around K star. Okay? So now I want to argue the fertility argument. So let me do that relatively quickly. So let's just take fertility as fixed. And let's look at men living under the patriarchal regime here. And just suppose that for whatever reason, the fertility was lower, okay? Instead of having, say, 4 kids each, they all had 3 kids. What would happen to their happiness that comes from wealth? Well, the happiness that comes from wealth would go up because basically they feel richer, there's fewer mouths to feed, they can afford to consume more, they can afford to bequeath more, give more to their kids. So they're happier under a regime if for some reason fertility is lower. Okay? What would happen if they lived under equal rights? Well, similar things. They'd be happier, again, because for the same amount of capital, of wealth, they would have fewer kids, and therefore they would be able to bequeath and consume more. Let's put everything together. I'm going to stand up. Let's put everything together. Okay, maybe I speak like this. Okay, when we put everything together, and I know it's a maze of lines, but the dashed lines are the new regime with lower fertility, and the other lines are the lines without the lower fertility. As you can see, what happens is that the reform is going to happen not at K star anymore, but rather at K star prime, okay? That is, it will happen at a lower level of wealth. And why will it happen? Well, because basically that conflict between the welfare of your boys and your girls happens at a lower value of wealth. You're wealthier. For the same amount of wealth, having fewer kids means you're basically wealthier on a per capita level. Okay. The last exercise I'm going to do, and then I'm going to show you some empirical evidence, is to show you what happens with a more generous patriarchal regime. So as I said, the Napoleonic Code, which did govern parts of U.S. states, in fact, 8 of them, treated married women better. In what sense? In the sense that actually, you know, if the husband died, they were left with half of the property instead of 1/3 of the property. So it's a more generous regime than was the regime of common law, the UK, the English common law regime. Okay, and I want us to use that to think: what's going to happen? Will change happen sooner, or will it happen later if you treat women, married women, better? And as you can see, this is under patriarchy. And the line without any dashes is the usual line. It shows you the happiness of men under patriarchy in the original regime. And then the dashed line shows you the happiness of men under a patriarchal regime, before, no equal rights, but it's a more generous one that treats married women better. And as you can see, you know, actually, you know, men are worse off at the beginning being generous to their wives because it means their daughters are treated better, but they don't care so much about their daughters at this point. They would prefer to be able to manage, you know, to not give so much to their own wives, but later on it makes them better off. What does that mean is going to happen in terms of when the regime will change? Well, let's look at the intersection of the happiness of men under equal rights with the intersection of the happiness of men under the new patriarchal regime. And what you can see, hopefully, is that the intersection goes from being here before to being on the right. That is, it means that reform to an equal rights regime will happen at a higher level of wealth. And since it takes more time to get here, it means that it's going to happen later. So kind of paradoxically, a regime that's nice to women makes women better off, but it postpones a day in which they will be even better off. Okay? So you might think about parallels between that and a welfare state that gives women some, let's say, very generous rights, say towards maybe staying, how much time you can stay at home once you have a kid. And maybe a very, very generous regime is actually not the best regime in terms of if what you're thinking about is women getting equal rights. Maybe a regime that's tougher forces these changes sooner. Just something to keep in mind. Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit about the empirics. I'm just going to check the time. I'm going to talk a little bit about the empirical work, okay? And just warn me when you think I'm close to my 50. Okay, let me skip the outline. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the constructions of the key variables for those of you who are interested. And if you're not, just fall asleep for about 10 minutes and then I'll be done with this part, okay? So the property rights variables, that is, when did women get rights, is a property rights variable from Geddes and Luke's. And what they did is, this is actually a very time-consuming task. You have to go back to the legal treatises and find out when they were actually laws created that gave women management and control of their estates, that is their physical property and personal property, and similarly for earnings. Those are two different things. One is your earnings. You weren't allowed to keep your earnings from working. And two, the other thing is your property. So they're two separate things, but they're obviously very related to one another. It's your right to control your wealth, if you'd like. Okay? So we're going to construct this variable, both, which takes a value of 1, and I hope there's some econometricians here, takes a value of 1 when both estate and earning rights have been granted and 0 otherwise. So that is, it lights up when both of them have it, and otherwise no. And I'm just going to show you, I'm going to assume most of you don't care about regressions, but I'm going to just show you a little bit of a picture that shows you when these rights were granted. So what I'm plotting there is on the x-axis, different U.S. states, and on the y-axis, I'm plotting different dates. And what it's showing you is the variation in time when different U.S. states got granted both rights to women when they did that. And you can see there's a lot of variation. My study is between 1850 and 1920. By 1920, all states except for 4 of them have granted these rights. Louisiana was the last state to grant these rights. They granted them in 1980. Okay, but what it means to do this in 1980 in a very modern world is very different than what it means to do it here. So we don't extend the analysis all the way out to 1980. The analysis ends in 1920. And as I said, by 1920, all but 4 states have granted these rights to women. Okay, the first year that you see there is Massachusetts in 1846. Another way may be better for all of you, given you probably don't know all of these symbols, abbreviations for states, is just to show you a map of the U.S. So let me do that, okay? Here's a map of the United States, and the darker ones are the ones that did it soonest. And as you can see, I have breakdowns, and then the lightest ones are the ones that did it last. Okay, and you see there's quite a lot of variation. It's sooner maybe in the Northeast, but there's quite a lot of variation across U.S. states as to when this happens, which is why the U.S. is a good laboratory for thinking about this issue. It's not that I'm particularly U.S.-centric. It's really is a good lab for this. Okay. The other variable I need to talk to you about is fertility. There's wealth. Wealth is going to be measured by, luckily, other people at the state level, so I'm going to take their measures of wealth. But the other measure I have to take is fertility. Now, we're talking about a time period that might be hard for you to imagine, where the infant mortality or children's mortality up to age 10 was near 35% at the beginning of this period. Okay, so try to imagine that. 1 in every third child dying before the age of 10. So the theory that I told you does not care about the child who does not make it to marriage. It cares about the girl that gets to be a wife, because that's the girl whose interest you're trying to protect from her husband. Okay? So really, I don't care about how many children people had then. I care about how many children survived to, a reasonable age, so the age that they could get married. And that's actually good for me because it's impossible to find statistics from the 1850 that ask people how many children they have. Instead, we have to do what development economists often do, or demographers do, which is to look at the ratio of children to the ratio of women. Okay, and that's what we're going to be doing. I'm going to be looking at children that I think have a reasonable chance of making it to the age of marriage. 10 is not a good age to get married, my daughter over there. Children from the age of 10 to 19, and I'm going to be looking at women ages 20 to 39. And I'm just going to call this variable fertility 10, and the 10 is simply to remind us that I'm not looking at children under the age of 10. Okay? I'm also only looking at whites. Why? Because white men are the ones who have power in the United States at this moment in time. If they change the law so as to make their daughters better off, it's white men who change the laws to make their white daughters better off. It's not something that's happening between whites and blacks. So I don't care about what is happening to the fertility of blacks or the wealth of blacks. And during a large time period here, part of this time period here, they're still going to be slaves. Just to give you a little bit of a picture, again, for the economists in the audience, I mean, this is what that variable looks like. I plotted how it evolves. The mean, the black line, is how it evolves over time. And for any decade, I've plotted the variation that exists across states, okay? So as you can see, there's a great deal of variation. So, like, you know, the variation of fertility goes between 3 at the max to somewhere below 1.5 at the min, and that's for 1850. And then, you know, these things are standard deviations, and I'm just plotting the mean for you. Okay. That's not the only source of variation that exists across states. So right now we have fertility is varying across states. I'm not showing you wealth, but wealth is also varying across states. States vary in other important ways that we need to take into account. Some states are not independent states during at least parts of these periods. They belong to territories. Territories make their laws potentially in ways that are different than independent states. So we're going to control for territorial status. Other differences across states have to do with their legal system. Some states are not just common law, but they have equity courts. I don't know if you had things like this in Italy. My feeling is you probably did. Equity courts were something that allowed, allowed wealthier individuals to try to contract around the rigidities of common law. So in particular, you might be able to protect a bit the property of your daughter by putting her uncle in charge of it, say. Okay, so it wasn't a way of giving women rights, and your uncle might turn out to be not a very nice guy, okay, but it was a way at least of affording a bit greater protection. And then, more important for our theory, is that some states, 8 of them, have community property law. They still do in the United States, by the way. These were inherited from the Spanish civil law or from the Napoleonic Code. And I explained a little bit the difference has to do with what the widow gets. We are going to think of states that are under community property law as being the more generous patriarchal regime that we talked about before, states that treat married women better, but that in the end might end up postponing reforms. Okay. Okay, this horrible slide is just telling you what I'm doing. So this slide is just telling you that I am going to be looking at the dependent variable, that is both. When did they get these rights? And I'm going to be controlling for a whole series of characteristics that I'm interested in. I'm going to be looking at fertility, I'm going to be looking at wealth at the state level, and I'm going to be doing it decade by decade. I'm not going to be able to look year by year, which is fine because we wouldn't believe that variation on fertility. I'm going to look at decade averages because that's the data that we have. We have data from the US Census, which comes out every 10 years, and therefore allows us to follow the evolution of these variables. Okay? So here, let me just go straight to the main result. Next time I'm getting a microphone on my dress. Okay, so here, I just want to show you here, the dependent variable is both. Okay, so when do they get both rights? And what I want to show you, and you know, Tito, you can tell me if how much detail I should go into these things. A hint would be appreciated. Okay, this is just I want to show you. Then I'm just going to be very broad. This is negative and significant. It means that we find that states with lower fertility. Grazie mille. Okay. State. Do I have to do something? States, hello? Okay? No. It's okay. I'll go with this until you get it fixed. Okay, so states with, this just tells you that states with with higher fertility saw these reforms happen later. That's what that negative sign means. There's no real effect of wealth. It seems to be bad to be a territory. And community systems, the ones that are nice to women, are much less likely to grant these rights, everything else equal. Okay? They're 60-something% less likely to grant these rights. So now I want to do something which I probably shouldn't do, but I'm going to do it very quickly, therefore, which is to try to introduce state fixed effects. What does state fixed effects mean? State fixed effects is that, there's characteristics that are varying across states. Here I used all the variation. Now I only want to use the variation that comes within a state. So it's like saying, I don't care about fertility differences, say, between New York and Massachusetts. I'm going to follow the fertility and the wealth changes in Massachusetts. I'm going to follow those of New York. I'm controlling for the state. And it's that variation that has to identify things. Here is a map, which I thought might be instructive, of what the United States looked like in 1850, which is the beginning of the sample. It changes over time. The pink things are independent states, and they kind of look more or less the way they look today. Basically, certainly all of the Northeast looks exactly the way. And as you see those big things over there, those are territories. Those contain various states, and I won't embarrass my daughter by trying to name the states that are in each block because I won't get it right. Okay, and then she'll have to apologize for me. Okay. Okay. So when we introduce these are called, for economists, state fixed effects or state dummies. When we introduce these dummies, let's look at this one. Our main variable of interest is fertility. It's still negative and significant. Being a territory is still bad. There's no effect of communities, and that's kind of puzzling. And then you kind of have to remember that when you control for states, the only way to identify your legal system is if you switch legal systems. And only 3 legal systems are switching. So it's very hard to identify it. So one thing we can do is instead of in control for states, we can introduce regional dummies. So you can think about the map of the United States, and the United States has 9 regions. I'm not going to show them to you right now. It has 9 regions. So instead of controlling for what state you're in, I can control for what region your state is in and ask what happens. And when you do that, you then, once again, see the negative effect of fertility, see the negative effect of being a community state. There's no effect, by the way, of wealth, and this is a very consistent result. My model actually does not predict that when wealth increases, you automatically want to become more in favor of women having more rights. In fact, as I argued, the effect is at first negative. When you're really poor, you don't care about women's rights, not women either having them or not having them. There's not much utility difference. It's only when you become somewhat mediumly rich. Those are the countries, those are the places in time that we expect people to be most patriarchal, not when they're very rich and not when they're very poor. We don't find either, for those of you who know, when we control for quadratic, we don't find any effects of wealth either. Okay, I have 5 more minutes? 5 minutes. So let me take you, I'm going to skip the endogenous fertility part, even though I know that you have questions about it, but maybe you will ask me and then I will show it at that point, okay? So I'm going to skip this part, unfortunately, and instead of the 5 minutes I have left, I'm going to do something which I think we should all do as scholars, which is to think about alternative hypotheses that could explain what we see. So to recap what we see this very clear, robust correlation that says lower fertility means you give these rights sooner. And we want to worry about why it is you have lower fertility, but we won't do it now. We'll do it when she asks the question. Okay? You have a clear job, Roberta. Okay. Then the other robust implication that we found in the data was, if you're a community state, you had Napoleonic law, you had Spanish law, those states were more generous. Those states give rights later. Everything else equal. They give rights later. Okay. So I want to now talk about other possible hypotheses. One possible hypothesis that you might have is that maybe it has something to do with schooling. Maybe those states where fertility was lower had more schooling for women, and maybe women were more educated in those states and were more pushing for the rights to manage their own property. That could be one hypothesis you might have. So let me just take care of that by hypothesis. There's many ways I can do it. I can look at when compulsory schooling was introduced in the state, and that has no effect. I can look at how much schooling girls have. That has no effect. I can look at how much schooling boys have. That has no effect. the compulsory school a year of schooling actually has an effect that's significant, but it goes in the wrong direction. It says the sooner you introduce compulsory schooling, the later was the reform. So schooling doesn't seem to be what it's about. It's not because of schooling that this happened. Another alternative hypothesis that you might have is that maybe some places had more cities, and these rights are more important maybe once you live in a city and there's more uses in which to put your property than an agricultural state, say. So one thing we can do is to control for the fraction of the population that lives in cities of a decent size, okay? Say maybe over 25,000 people or something like that. Let's control for that fraction. And when we do, nothing happens to our results, and that variable is not important. Another possibility that people have advanced for why women got rights, at least in the United States, has to do with scarcity of women, okay? And this is used a lot sometimes to think about what might happen later on in China or India. Women are scarce, okay? Well, in the United States, in some of the states, particularly the West, women were scarce because, it tended to be male settlers that moved west first, and then the women would follow. And one way you might want to make your state more attractive is to pass laws that are better for married women. That would be one thing to do. So we can look at male, this is the proportion of the population that is male, and ask whether the proportion of the population that is male does anything to change the probability of women's rights. And as we see, it doesn't. And nothing changes for fertility 10. And then lastly, we might say, well, maybe we're not looking deeply enough, okay? Let's look at women's suffrage. Most of us think that suffrage is women voting, women getting voting rights. That's something that happened in the United States, also at different points in time, much more compressed, and on the whole, later than married women properties rights. Okay, well, is there any relationship between when women got suffrage, when they got voting rights, in other words, in a state, and when they got these property rights? And your answer is no. There's no relationship. It has no predictive value. So whatever mechanism is leading women to have voting rights, it doesn't seem to be related to the mechanism, the reasons, the deep causes for women getting property rights. Okay, there doesn't seem to be a relationship between the two. I'm going to conclude now, hopefully within my time, and just say, well, the theory that I put up predicted that fertility would, lowering fertility would hasten the day in which women got these rights because men saw it in their interest to give it to them. A legal regime that was more favorable to women, in fact, would make these rights be postponed because men would not feel this contradiction between being a father and being a husband till much later on. And lastly, it predicted also that enough capital accumulation would actually lead to reform. So enough wealth would lead to reform. But actually, when you look at the data, you tend not to find any sort of relationship. Mine predicted an inverse, a U-shaped relationship. Here you tend not to find a relationship, and it might have to do with the other theme of this conference, which is income distribution. So I've been talking about men as though all men are the same, and of course all men are not the same. They differ in many ways, and one of the ways that they differ was in how much wealth they had. And in fact, that picture that I showed you about wealth and the way you feel about things goes like this. Well, it means that actually poor men might be in favor of women having equal rights, or they couldn't care very much. Rich men might really want women to have equal rights, and men in the middle, they might be the ones who are really against rights. So it has a lot to do with the distribution of wealth in a society, and then how do we map that distribution of wealth to distribution of power? Who makes the laws, etc.? And that's a very deep and interesting question, which I don't have that much to say about right now. Okay. Anyway, thank you very much for being such a patient and good audience.
Grazie alla professoressa Fernandez anche per...
Thank you, Professor Fernandez. Thank you, because you had to be fast, but you have been very clear anyway, so thank you for this. I would say that we collect 2-3 questions, and then you can answer them Is there anybody wishing to ask questions?
Vedo molto perché
Speriamo che
il microfono per
Let's hope that the microphone works. In which language? Asks the lady. You have the floor. In Italian, then. If poor men are in favor, tendentially, to women, why are the majority of poor societies patriarchal now? Why is it so that in Asia and Africa we do not have systems that favor women in general? And then fertility seems to be a proxy for female emancipation. Is it really so? Because I see a statistical and conceptual issue there. Because if fertility is low, it is normally because women are emancipated. So these are the 2 points that I wanted to raise.
Early on, you dismissed the idea that activism might be responsible for the changes you're talking about. Would it be possible to map the frequency and the occurrence of activist activities, women's rights conventions, etc., in different locations, and test that?
Ok, forse può rispondere.
Okay, thank you for both questions. The challenge of developing countries is a very interesting one and important. Precisely to take care of the fact that fertility is endogenous and may respond to a lot of things, one of the things I do is to say, instead of looking at fertility, let me look at a proxy for fertility, which is infant mortality. So, and what I do is I show that the places where infant mortality was largest, everything else equal, where children tended to die more, those places at any given year, any given decade, tended to have smaller families. And in fact, it's there that we see women's rights, women's property rights come sooner. So it's not necessarily the part of it that women are, all women are actually over time having fewer and fewer kids here. But in some states, at any moment in time, infant mortality is larger, and therefore there's actually fewer surviving children. That's what we can show. There's fewer surviving children. Those places with fewer surviving children see it happen sooner. And it's hard to believe that that is coming because of women's power. It's coming because of infant mortality rather than women's power. Furthermore, if we thought that it was a mechanism like the one you are alluding to, that it has to do with women having more emancipation, and that's why they're having fewer children, then we have to ask, well, why is it that there's no relationship between women's voting rights and women's property rights? And we do not see a relationship in the data. Some states give voting rights early on, but they take a long time to give property rights. So it seems to be two different things. As for what's happening with developing countries, you're right. We've seen that fertility is falling in those countries. It's still very high in some of them, but overall it's been falling. I would say probably women have more rights than they used to in those countries, but it's not enough. And it is something that different groups are pushing, okay? So, like, I was talking to an economist the other day, and they were telling me the Grameen Bank, one of the things that it did was to, in fact, not only give money for children, not only give money for women in order to develop property, but also to push for reforms. They would say to the government, they would push for reforms that gave women property rights. And so it's been seen as a big deal in that context. In terms of mapping female activism, I didn't try to do that. I would love to. That data set, as far as I know, doesn't exist, so one would have to go to the data and try to figure it out. But it's precisely the fact that for women's voting rights, we know of activities, even bomb-throwing activities by anarchists, okay, during that time period. Those were big rights. They were really fighting for those rights. You see them come up time and time again in meetings of women. You do not see the same thing about women's property rights. Now, maybe this is a concern. Maybe we think, well, why weren't they concerned more about their property rights? And one should think about why. But this was not something they fought for the way they fought for voting.
It's very interesting. Ok, ci sono altre domande?
Are there additional questions? None. So I would say that we can close here. We thank Professor Fernandez very much and enjoy the rest of the evening, all of you.
That's very interesting, the last notation about activism.
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe in the next century we fought more also for economic rights and not only for political rights.
But also it makes sense that they would first want political power because then they could change all these laws.
Proprio non diventare semplicemente dei funzionari come in Europa.
Disuguaglianza. Mafia significa anche impoverimento.
Un treno che parte, una scuola che apre.
Perché dovrei preoccuparmi? Capiscono che la mafia è tanto più forte quando una parte.
Come si fa?
La scienza ha senso, i contratti in sé non sono né buoni